So welcome back to the world of Tash Mia. We're now podcast number 2. Last podcast, we talked a little bit about kink and BDSM world and about how I got to be a professional dominatrix. So let's jump straight back into it. So last week, I talked a little bit about how I first started my career. I met my friend who was a dom in her personal life, and we set up our studio together. So we'd been domming for a little while together, maybe a few months, and I was loving it. I was really in my element. I was really building myself as a dominatrix and finding out who I was, building clients, really honing my craft. However, my friend was not loving it so much. And I think it's really interesting because I learned a really interesting point, which was who we are in our work life. If it sometimes overlaps too much with who we are in our personal life, it can get a bit messy. And basically what was happening for her was this was her kink in her personal life. This was her thing. This is what turned her on in life. And she was having a hard time coming to work and doing the exact same thing that was turning her on in her personal life with her personal subs in a professional setting with clients that were often, because we were starting out, not known, and you do get new clients all the time. And she didn't have that power dynamic relationship as an underlying foundation. So she was actually discovering the professional life probably wasn't really for her. So at this point, after she realized this, I decided that I would go out on my own. And I looked for my own studio and I set up my studio in which I am still today. And I got more equipment and bought the remaining toys I needed. And luckily by this point, I already had some clients. I already had a few regulars. So I did, luckily enough, I was able to start domming on my own. But I think that brings to one really interesting point is about finding out the type of dom you are. And I get asked this a lot from people as like, they assume that dominatrix is one character and there's like one type of dominatrix. And I think we've all seen her in every bad BDSM film, which is the mean bitch dom. And don't get me wrong, there is the mean bitch dom, and that might be who your inner dom is, and that's fine. But there's a lot of different types of doms. Personally, as I said, I found from my very first session that I was quite a sarcastic dom. I'm also a very sensual dom. And I bring a lot of sensuality to my sessions and to how I approach BDSM. I'm also a bit of a sadist, which for those who don't know, is I enjoy inflicting pain on others, obviously with consent being the essential part of that. So I kind of call myself the 3S dom, which is sensual, sadistic, and sarcastic. And that's my style. Now, obviously, I am a professional dominatrix, so I need to have range. I can't just go into every session the exact same character or into every scene because I am coming it from a different angle, which is the professional one. Funnily enough, I would say about 80% of my clients are subs who enjoy more of a sensual dom rather than mean bitch dom. And I think that's probably because that's what I'm attracting in my look, in the way I show myself in maybe my socials, the way I interact with clients when they're inquiring. I think you will attract clients that probably fit your natural style a little bit more. However, that being said, I definitely know how to switch it on for mean bitch dom, or, often role play is a part of a BDSM scene. So I might be mean nurse, or I might be the schoolgirl who's humiliating the boy in the schoolyard. So as a professional dom, you do need that broad range to play those different characters. But I think if you're coming at BDSM from a new point, or someone who's trying out a new role as being a dominatrix or a dominant if you're a man, I think it's really important that you find your style and connect with what is it that you're wanting to get out of the scene? What is it that is turning you on? And I don't mean turning you on sexually. I've said that a few times. I mean, what's lighting your fire? What's getting you going? BDSM is not just a sexual practice. And again, something we'll come to in another episode. BDSM is practiced for a myriad of reasons. So what's your reason for practicing? And what's getting you going in that scene? What attitude? What's your alter ego? I think that's really where you find who your inner dom is. And believe me, everyone has a dom inside of them. All you need is that little flicker of interest, and that's enough to get you going. So now you've decided to find that inner dom and get on this journey. And I guess one of the first things you're going to ask is, what are the rules of this game? And the thing is, there are no set rules in BDSM. Of course, there's lots of books and things you can read about BDSM, but there's no manual that says chapter 1, chapter 2. But there are some really important foundation and principles that you will need to learn to safely engage in play. So the very first one I think is the most important is consent. And I think people can hear the word consent and think, oh yeah, I know what consent is. That's just saying yes or no. But the thing is, there's a lot more to consent in BDSM. And also the fact is that you practice consent in BDSM every time you're in a scene or engaging in play. Consent in BDSM is not just oh yeah, I'll do that. Consent has to be freely given, so there's no pressure from anyone or outside forces, and it has to be enthusiastically given, which means it needs to be a hell friggin' yes. So that's what we want to hear in consent with BDSM, is it's freely given, it's a hell friggin' yes, and then the third thing is it can be revoked at any time. And when I say revoked at any time, I literally mean any time. Before you will start a scene with someone, you will have a chat, you will have negotiation, you will have consent, and you'll go through a whole bunch of things. Now, even if someone has consented to an activity at the beginning of a scene, or well, in the pre-scene chat, if you're in the middle of the scene and you're performing that activity and they're not feeling it, they can revoke that consent at any time. They can say, hey, look, I'm not feeling this, it's not for me. And that consent is gone. And you, as the dominant player in this scene, that means stop. That consent has been revoked. And if you go further, you are breaking consent. And that is a pretty serious offense in the world of BDSM. Consent is something you really need to practice. I think we don't really use it enough in everyday life. Especially if you look at the modern dating scene, how often have you gone out on a date and someone has ever asked you if you wanted to kiss at the end of it? Or you might be making out with someone on a second, third, or whatever date, or first date, who cares? And they stop and ask you whether you actually want to take it further that night or morning or whenever it is. I think there's a lot that the normal dating world could really learn from the way that BDSM people and practitioners practice consent. It's very important. The next thing I think you really need to understand, and it kind of links in with consent, is boundaries. So boundaries are basically your limits. A boundary will be something you don't want to do. A boundary might be a scene you don't want to partake in. It could be a myriad of things, but a boundary is something that someone comes to you and says, I am interested in this, this, and this, and this, but And boundaries are very important, but boundaries are often change over time. So something that might have started as a boundary for you in your play, for example, it might be, let's say, anal play. You might have originally said, I like mucking around, I like being spanked on my butt, but do not go anywhere near my butthole, don't put anything near it, that's my boundary. But over time, you get relaxed or you start getting interested in maybe a different type of scene, or maybe you're watching some different type of BDSM porn and you're like, actually, that's looking pretty good to me now. You can renegotiate your boundaries. And so that's why it's really important that even with regular play partners, you're always talking boundaries. You're always renegotiating those boundaries. And I guess that brings us into the next one I want to talk about, which is negotiation, which kind of brings together your consent and boundaries. Before you start a scene or before you engage in play, even if it's at a social BDSM party, for example, is you will have a pre-scene negotiation. And this is where you discuss things like your boundaries, which include things like hard limits and soft limits, which I will talk again about later. You would discuss consent, but you'll also discuss something called disclosure, which can be quite a difficult one to get your head around sometimes, and to know what information you need to disclose to a play partner. So disclosure basically is information that I think my play partner needs to know in order to perform a scene. Now, if you're at a social kink party and you've just met someone, do they need to know that you have some childhood trauma around dog collars, for example? And this is how I would answer you. If the scene that you're about to do will likely evoke some memory or past trauma to do with that, I would say yes, I would discuss it and say, look, I have some issues around dog collars due to some past issues. Do not collar me up in the scene. So that would be information you would need to disclose to play with that partner to be responsible and to be safe. However, if you're about to go into, say, a spanking scene where there's no restraints on your neck or anywhere, and it's not relevant at all, I wouldn't say you'd need to disclose that information. Same being said, not only is it event-based, so as I said, you're in maybe a social scene, but also it's based on the type of relationship you have with that play partner, I think. If you're in a deep DS relationship, which is a Dom-Sub relationship, there's probably going to be more things you're going to disclose to that partner, and more things that you might share with them about your past or your history or your triggers or your boundaries. And so in those circumstances, I would say it also is dependent on the type of relationship of you and your play partner. So there's some really big concepts to get your head around. But as I said, BDSM, it's all about learning. It's all about exploring. And there's really no wrong way to do it. As I said, the guiding principles are there, and that's really to make sure that people are playing it safe and responsibly. And I think if you know how to communicate, which a lot of people don't, unfortunately, you will be able to get there and have those conversations. So overall, communication is the biggest term and skill you need to acquire when practicing BDSM, to be able to tell someone what you want, to be able to tell someone what you don't want. And interestingly, you would be amazed at how many people can't even do that with their partners. By default, in BDSM, you'll find that most people in the community are amazing communicators. And because they're having these really, what we would call in the vanilla world, difficult conversations over and over again. So you will find that kinky people, the people who are practicing BDSM, really understand the power of communication and how to really harness that even in their everyday life. And I think that's why I'm so passionate about opening up these topics, and still taboo topics in a lot of cases, is to get people talking, to get people communicating with their partners. Because if you're talking about it, you're bringing it out of the shadows per se. You're not ashamed about what your kinks are, and you can live a much more fulfilled and happy life, I believe. I think another question when we're talking about all these concepts, and especially around BDSM that comes up, is what's that fine line between mental health and BDSM? And it's really, if you look at the concepts we've discussed today, consent, boundaries, negotiation, disclosure, communication, they're really the guiding principles that make the difference between something being something that could potentially be harming mentally to someone and something that is there to be enjoyed, but also used as a tool to work through past traumas. A lot of people who have trauma and practice BDSM, not that there's any research showing that there's any more rates of people with past trauma who practice BDSM versus the vanilla world, I will say. There's been no correlation in the research to date proving that. But people who do use BDSM to work through past traumas, it actually has been shown to be very beneficial when practiced in a safe environment, because it allows the person to rewrite the script. It allows the person to regain that control of that past trauma. So I just want to make sure people are aware that BDSM is not some sort of mental torture or something that people are going in willy-nilly and hitting around and abusing people on their free will and doing what they want. There's guiding principles that underline everything that is done in a scene. So now you've got the guiding principles, you understand some of the skills that you need to harness and build upon in your BDSM journey. You might ask, where do I start? Now, I'm not going to tell you to go and plan an elaborate scene just yet. I'm actually going to tell you to start small, start soft is always my advice. And what I would recommend for people, especially people who have a play partner that they are wanting to engage in this journey with, is at home, get into your character and just get used to ordering your partner to get you a cup of tea, for example. So instead of saying, hey honey, can you please make me a cup of tea? Say, pet, make me a cup of tea and I want it this temperature. And once you kind of feel comfortable giving those little ordinary everyday commands, maybe move it up a notch and say, go down on me tonight and this is how I want you to do it. And you'll find that more and more you're going to get more comfortable giving these commands, and the other person's going to get more comfortable receiving these commands. And I tell you now, you're going to start finding the excitement of power exchange. And there's going to be a whole new level and a whole new can of worms opening up to your relationship that you can explore. And you'll even get something that we're going to talk about next episode, is a high. So in the next episode, we're going to be exploring all that and more. And in the meantime, get your kink on.